Hi, Professor Crawford. It's really nice to see you again. May I call you Malachi?
Yes, please do. Thank
Okay,
you.
good. And would you be so kind just introduce yourself to the audience to get us started here?
Sure. Malachi Crawford, Associate Professor and Chair of the History Program at Prairie View A&M University. Um, Research is 20th century American history with an emphasis on looking at the intersection of law and religion in the African American experience.
All right, just great. My name is Barbara Savage, and I'm on the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Africana Studies. And I have taught 20th century African American history, have an interest in religion and politics, and have written about that. Also, an earlier interest in media and race and religion, and more recently in education as a institution of great importance to African Americans. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have, and because it brings together so many themes in 20th century African American history, whether you're interested in religion or not. And so I thought we'd just go ahead and jump in and take advantage of your expertise and your work on Black Power and religion and the Black Power era in religion. And I think for Black Power, many people, or most people, might be surprised to know that we're actually discussing religion in the context of the Black Power era rather than the so-called civil rights period. So do you want to start by giving folks kind of a quick background on the relationship between religion and Black Power in that period, or however else you want to introduce us to that topic?
Sure. So my understanding, well, let's get some historical
Mhm.
perspective on this. Um, Most historians, I think, date the emergence of the Black Power era with Stokely Carmichael, who was the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the summer of 1966 in Mississippi, where he calls for, demands Black Power. But when we look at uh, sort of the Black religious experience, it wasn't separate or isolated from what was going on at the time. In fact, those sort of key principles or demands found themselves both in sort of the theological expression of Black religious communities as well as in sort of their activism. And so Black religious communities were very much a part of and active in um, sort of these demands that were being made and called by Black Power activists.
We will define Black Power. He will listen and recognize it. That's all. That's all. Yeah. So you ought not to be worried about their debates about violence. You ought to tell them clear. If you don't want any trouble, keep your filthy white hands off our beautiful black.
And I think that our attention on the civil rights movement and the kind of more easily visible relationship between Black churches and that movement, really overwhelm our understanding of that period. So I think this is really important, and the information that you're bringing. I think perhaps the most dramatic examples, or at least in terms of the legal history, at least as I understand it, and then you can say more about this, I hope, for us, it has to do with the Nation of Islam and the relationship between the state and the Nation of Islam in this period. And if you would just want to kind of jump into that, and then we'll bring it into the larger discussion about that period.
With respect to the Nation of Islam, we're going to see the surveillance of the community by the FBI as well as local law enforcement agencies. And again, these experiences and harassment of Nation of Islam members during the Black Power era. But I'll just say that this doesn't start in the Black Power era. It does have its manifestations or origins in an earlier period. Just to give some context, 1957 is really the year when we see the FBI as well as the CIA, the federal government coming together to really surveil, to use its powers to surveil and investigate the Nation of Islam on both a domestic and international level. And that has everything to do with the Nation of Islam's outreach and its relationship that it's beginning to form with the government of Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. At that time, Nasser's government was a concern, and the Middle East was a concern for the U.S. Eisenhower would announce his what becomes the Eisenhower Doctrine, where he says that the U.S. will give aid and military aid and economic assistance to military governments. The U.S. To Middle Eastern governments that were in the on the bridge of being overrun by sort of communist sympathizers. And so this is during the context of the Cold War. But for the Nation of Islam, its outreach to the government of Nasser and Egypt was clearly religiously based. Elijah Muhammad wanted to have the ministers of the Nation of Islam trained in Arabic at the premier institution for doing so in the world, Al-Azhar University in Cairo. What happens to the Nation of Islam raises profound constitutional questions, because this is simply a religious community attempting to sort of freely associate with other, Muslims, members of its faith, and in doing so, it brings about, this, the awesome power of the U.S.'s surveillance apparatus down on it.
And I think one of the things that's really useful about what you just said, for those of us who don't know, as much as you do, is to place this in the context not only of the Cold War, but that the state's threat or perceived threat from the Nation of Islam is an international threat, that it's not just worried about domestic implications, although they are, but to put it in that larger context, I think is really, really useful. And it's certainly something that's really overlooked, and we forget how global religion is more generally as a nexus in terms of the ways that we think about African Americans in the world and in the United States. And so, but I didn't mean to really take you off course there, but I just wanted to interject that, because I think that's something that might be surprising to people who, who are listening. But do you want to say more in particular about the Nation of Islam and how that worked itself out, either through the courts and law or otherwise?
Yeah, and so and I thank you for that, because let me just say, so prior to 1957, the Nation of Islam was really looked at as this odd religious cult-like community, and it becomes very much politicized as this un-American, irreligious, violent sort of community that is hostile to the national security interests of the U.S. And so that's the way in which it's framed, and that framework allows for the FBI to surveil it, as well as the CIA to surveil its actions, the behavior of its members. During the Black Power era, just one case that comes to mind is Webster versus Brewer. This is a story that emerges in the state of Alabama in 1970, and the origins of this case somewhat start with the Black Power conference that took place in 1969, where James Foreman calls for he calls for this Black Manifesto, which basically says or demands reparations, but reparations from specific religious communities for Black suffering and enslavement and whatnot, and discrimination and whatnot. And so as part of that call, James Foreman's Black Manifesto calls for the creation of a Black land bank. The Nation of Islam, that really captures their attention, because they've been calling for, and they've, within their community and nationally, they've been calling for this, or suggesting that African Americans need to acquire land, that land is the basis of not only one's identity, but the future of a people. By the summer of 1969, the Nation of Islam purchases land in Pell City, St. Clair County, Alabama. And so, the purpose of this land is to secure acreage for basically a cattle farm. By November of 1969, there's a really active resistance and opposition to their presence for no other reason than the fact that they're Black and that they're Muslim and that they have this space. The Attorney General for the state of Alabama provides protection and helps to organize this effort to dispossess the Nation of Islam of their land and to basically force them off this property. In November of 1969, you see the local residents poisoning the cattle. You see them shooting the cattle with rifle fire. Local law enforcement at that time begins to arrest the farmhands, the Black farm workers that were on the property, some of whom weren't even in Nation of Islam members, but they arrest these individuals under a law that basically said that if you were a Muslim, and this is a state law, that said if you were a Muslim, you had 5 days to register with the state as a foreign agent. So the state of Alabama had on its books this law was initially aimed at communists and Nazis, and the statute, still said that. It just in around 1962 they added Muslims because the Nation of Islam's presence in Alabama was growing. They added Muslims to the law, but it's not until 1969 that they used that law as a precursor for to disrupt and the presence and the growth of the Nation of Islam in Pell City, Alabama, and that's the.
So how do they end up in court? How did the court case
well? So
begin?
the various members of the Nation of Islam had been arrested under this statute, and so the Nation of Islam's lawyers would challenge the statute in question, and so ultimately the court ruled that the law was overly broad, and in terms of its basically saying that Muslims had to register as foreign agents, hadn't defined who was a Muslim, and in fact the moment that you do that becomes problematic. It's problematic that you have even identified Muslims, but as being agents of some foreign government, a foreign entity. The rationale for doing so again was that this group was violent. It was a threat to the security interests of the state, and when the case is being challenged in court, the Attorney General for the state of Alabama reaches out to J. Edgar Hoover, who's the FBI, director of the FBI, for some type of information on the Nation of Islam that would support him in the courts.
That's a really interesting story, and I think that for many people, including me, who think about the Nation of Islam and religious liberty, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is actually Muhammad Ali and the case to the Supreme Court that really raises certain questions about whether the Nation of Islam is in fact a religion, and I'm using that loosely, and whether his claim to be a conscientious objector is therefore legitimate. So it's really interesting to hear about this case, which in completely different setting, but really, raising issues about not just state resistance, but the way the state is also enacting white community resistance to the presence of the Nation of Islam in this way, in the way that you described. So I think that's really useful for us, because I think we all kind of get caught in certain traps when we think about this period.
But to follow the Mr. Muhammad, we have supported ourselves, and this is why we're able to maintain our own private schools. We have our own farms. We have our own newspaper plant. We have our own bakeries and other things, because we do these things ourselves.
It's not just the Nation of Islam. We do see this sort of over surveillance and harassment of Black religious sort of communities that are taking on sort of, viable political positions and
Right.
activist
And I think
traditions.
it's kind of in the examples that you give us and that we see, both in terms of the context, the political context of the period in the 1960s, and which, obviously extends, forward. And so you have the combination of the context and something like the Nation of Islam. There is this conflation of that with an international threat, as well. Part of it, and there's this theme in African American religious history having to do with so-called cults and sects, like what to do with the not traditionally recognizably straight up Christian traditional religions, and emphasis and shifts in terms of the representations of Black masculinity, charges of violence. All of that gets combined in this period. And so the threat, or the perceived threat to the state, just gets magnified and magnified and magnified, for those who are in charge of those institutions and those organizations. And so I think this is a really interesting illustration, actually, of that conflict really brought to reality in a way that we may not feel or see as sharply, or in some of the other kinds of chilling effects that we've seen on mainline denominations around this question of what is political and what is religious. And if you're practicing the state's going to protect you unless you're challenging something else that starts to look, political. And that, in both of those definitions, politics and religion are so amorphous and so easily manipulated. One of the things that we see Black religious intellectuals kind of wrestling with, throughout the 20th century, and Carter G. Woodson is an example, because it's not an entirely tongue-in-cheek kind of thing from him, but he really does make an argument in the 1920s for the creation of a single Black Christian denomination, and something that he called the United Negro Church, with this notion that, I think underneath that, in this period of increasingly large corporate forms, including, corporate financial institutions, that in order to fight effectively in the 20th century politically, you need some large national organization that can corral African Americans, who by then are increasingly being scattered and migrating out of the South and moving all over the country. So what do we do with, at his point, I guess at the time, probably 14 million Black people? How can we create a truly national organization that would meld both religion and politics? And he has in the back of his mind that other kind of quasi-religious organization of the United Negro Improvement Association, which had been created, by Marcus Garvey, which I think, though not, relied on religious iconography, and it certainly had a set of followers who were as engaged and committed as one would be to a religion. And then Garvey himself also then includes certain aspects that we see coming once again in the Black Power movement, and some aspects also related that we see in the self-determination, land, let's go off by ourselves and figure out how to just organize and create a separate Black community. And so that religion really sits there, and I mean, there's an understanding of the power of religion and religious institutions in Black life. How do we corral that? What do we do with it? And how do we deploy it in political ways? And had something like that been successful, and there are many, many millions of reasons why it would not, but it's a very interesting concept, then I think the kind of state surveillance and the kind of state response that you saw to the Nation of Islam would also have been much more visibly, it would have been a much more visible kind of threat. There's something about the smallness and the individuality of churches and denominations that diminishes the threat. It doesn't disappear it, but it actually, as an institutional force, I think it makes it much more likely to see what you saw in Alabama, which is a very virulent local state, powerfully both violent and quasi legal response to Black people who are basically, trying to buy land and grow cattle. Even though we live in a country with a church-state separation, which has become more and more porous, as you know, in recent decades. But nonetheless, religious institutions are also legal institutions in the sense that they have to be made legal by the state. I mean, they have charters, they have deeds of property. In urban areas, they're affected a lot by zoning laws, by what can and cannot be built where. And while those things are often invisible, it's hard to imagine that the kinds of tensions that we're talking about have not also played out in these more subtle powers of the state. Not everything ends up in court. It's what I'm saying. I think about all the Black churches in the South that were burned out and that were subject, and so you have a law enforcement that is turning a blind eye to that, a lack of enforcement and a lack of protection from the state, which is also a powerful non-tool, or showing that the state and its powers are allied with aspects of white communities in particular that are committed to violence and destruction as a way to threaten and scare and challenge. And so I think you see it play out, in that way.
The question of Christian theology and how sort of the era and this period sort of might have brought about some changes. The individual that I think of sort of most clearly in this sort of way is Albert Cleage in the Shrine of the Black Madonna.
Black people have to build their own institutions, their own institutional power base from which to work. And the only possible power base that black people have is the black church, which has to be restructured. Its orientation has to be taken out of the clouds and begin to build on earth a kind of a nation of black people here on earth who are dealing with reality in a programmatic kind of way.
He was someone who coined the term Black Christian nationalism. And so one of the things that he did was he made the contention or the argument that Jesus was a Black revolutionary speaking to a predominantly Black or mostly Black audience, and that he was in the business of challenging the authority of a mostly white Gentile Rome.
Yep.
And so, and he says, he makes the contention that the church is not a static institution, but it's actually a movement. The church is a movement, that it has to be involved in questions that are of profound political interest and economic interest to Black communities.
Right.
And where you don't see that happening, that those people aren't really saved. They're not involved with these fundamental questions, that then they're not saved.
The thing that's really fascinating to me always about African American religion writ large is the internal diversity within, the idiosyncrasy of it, so that the Black church I go to is different from the Black church that's around the corner. The role of personality and history and culture in each individual African American church, and then that plays itself out, or can play itself out much more largely in denominations. I mean, beyond theological difference, but the particular histories of the AME church or of Black churches, Baptist churches in the South. Here in Philadelphia, we'll see the birth of Black independent religions through Mother Bethel and the African Episcopal Church that evolves here. And yet another route goes off with folks who want to remain Episcopalian, and found in 1792 the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. Same branch, and then they just take a different route. And this is all to say, it makes it really difficult to generalize. But this notion of Jesus as a radical figure that Cleage embraces and really lays out. Other people, of course, have done that, including more recent writers, Aubrey Hendricks, and any number of other folks who are who carry that argument out intellectually, that the representations of Jesus and the varieties of representation of Jesus are also a reflection of the individuality of within Black churches. But it's powerful, and imagery should never be should never be disregarded. I think it's very, very important. In my own church, which is, and I am a member of the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas here in Philadelphia, which is a Black Episcopal church. But every Sunday, I'm looking at stained glass that's three images. So it's Jesus and two of the apostles. And some years ago, we had to have the stained glass removed and cleaned. And when it returned, Jesus and the apostles were brown and black. That there is actually a kind of a small stained glass industry that changes those representations to make them look, more like people in the region from which that emerges. And every day, every Sunday that I sit there and the sun kind of gleams through those images, it is a very, very powerful representation to me, and in its own way embraces a kind of radical reimagining of Christianity, of the Christian world. And so I think, to kind of get back to the question of politics and who is surprised and or threatened by what might be going on in Black churches, there's something about the mystery of religion. And I don't mean mysticism. I just really mean the mystery and privacy of religion that gives it a mystique that can both overestimate and underestimate, the internal political power of the people in the pews or within whatever religious setting it is. So I'm wandering a little bit because there's so much to talk about, but this notion of a radical Jesus or a radicalized Christianity, I think, is the core of the threat that, to his credit, J. Edgar Hoover recognized and then tried to squelch and kill. It's so interesting, and I'm really glad that you brought up Albert Cleage, because that's such an extraordinary example of someone really wrestling so thoughtfully with theological questions, political questions, a question of community formation. And it really brought to mind that, we're having this conversation and we have not yet talked about James Cone and Black liberation theology. And so I wonder, just for the benefit of folks who are listening and might not be familiar with him and his work, extraordinarily important scholar and thinker who, sadly passed away a few years ago. Could you just line out what you see as the kind of key tenets of Black liberation theology for folks who are listening?
Sure. So James Cone is the founder of Black liberation theology, and this his articulation of this idea really emerges. I mean, this is a really essential, I think, question that you asked, because his articulation of this idea emerges as a result of the Black Power movement, of the very fast-moving questions and demands that are being raised in 1966.
There can be no reconciliation with masters as long as they are masters. No reconciliation as long as men are in prison. There can be no communication between the masters and the slaves until masters no longer exist as masters, are no longer present as masters. The Christian task is to rebel against all masters, destroying their pretensions to authority and ridiculing the symbols of power.
Cone takes the position that there is no place for a colorless God in a society where people suffer precisely because of their color. Cone takes the position that God is Black and Jesus is Black. And he also takes the position that God must speak from, or must speak to, the Black condition, inherently so, because God is a God of and for the oppressed, right? And God makes himself known through the liberation of the oppressed. And so that's how he's reading scripture.
We see those ideas, as you know, articulated differently, but along a similar vein of thought, even in the work of Howard Thurman, a much more traditional Black theologian. And Thurman was a writer and a theologian, a former dean of the divinity school at Howard, but who also saw Jesus as basically being allied with and whose primary mission, if you were, was to protect and advance the needs of the most oppressed. And he expresses it in much more lyrical ways. And Thurman is also then a powerful influence on King. And then Thurman and King and Benjamin Mays, who was the president of Morehouse, but who also had been dean of the veterinary school at Howard, also then moved towards this universalism that really tries to extend the boundary of Christianity to include the work of Gandhi and others, especially Eastern religions, which are very influential to each of them. So all of that is going on, and I think it's just a further testament to all of the diversity among these thinkers. But I would, just ask you a question about Cleage and Cone and how they relate to kind of the emergence of a concept of Black Christian nationalism, or something maybe by a different name, or can you talk to us a little bit about that, and I'll tag on after.
Sure. So this question of where does God stand relative to oppression, right? And that God can't be neutral, that you can't have that fellowship, that calls or demands for fellowship without justice are something of a con, if you will. That it's that type of faith is, if not abhorrent to God, it's something that is unfamiliar. That is not a true reading of Scripture. And so you see both with Cone in terms of the call for, or the demand that of the notion, right, the interpretation that God is a God of and for the oppressed, and makes himself known through their liberation. That through line, we see that with Albert Cleage's position then, that the church must be an activist church, that the church is actually a movement and not a static institution, and that the church has to be capable of sort of spinning out all of the necessary needs of Black community. That and then again that Jesus was not only Black, but a Black revolutionary, challenging the authority of the state.
Yeah, and so then politics and political struggle and political challenge is seen as the essence of, in this case, of Christian belief. And you can't get away from that. And if you're going to call yourself a believing Christian, it has to include that kind of political approach based on the scriptures and the reading of the life of Jesus. And that is, it is radical in the best uses of the word, and a real kind of encapsulates a number of threads and ideas that have been there for a long time, but it also really stakes out a really bold new ground about the radical potential of Black churches and Black Christianity, if in all the ways that that one would hope for. Even though I would say on a practical and pragmatic level, which is where I live, I do still see that as a very challenging project, but not one not to be pursued. And for any kind of pursuit of something as kind of magnificently radical as that, you really would also have to think about a reorientation of Black religious life and culture and leadership and thinking to realize that in our own lives and times. We've been hearing a lot more recently in the last number of election cycles and beyond that about white Christian nationalism, and you talk about Black Christian nationalism. And I think for me, one of the things that I think can be learned about the rise of a conservative white evangelical movement tied to these questions that have evolved over time and made more clear these notions of white Christian um, nationalism is that first is the way that white evangelical churches realized the organizational potency of the churches that they already had. And I would say literally just following the same playbook that we saw black churches use in the civil rights movement, used without the benefit of the protection of the state, without the benefit of access to capital and money, and without access to kind of legitimacy that whiteness brings to those institutions, and the kind of, and not to mention the sheer numbers of folks who are involved in, in that movement. And I think we should call it a movement. It certainly radicalized and changed national, local politics and political policies up and down, the line on everything, from abortion and, and more, and education, all of that. And so I think that there's a way in which that learning and then flipping it another way really is, was missed by sort of national political media, because for the most part, national political media know little and care even less about religion more generally, unless it's something that's kind of radical and in their, kind of in their faces. And that speaks to some broader questions that in some ways white evangelicals picked up and learned a lot from the civil rights movement and Black Power movement, and brought it into a larger realm, and one that was much more largely funded, and also that had a much wider reach, because, as I say, we still remain, a minority in this country. And as independent churches, and many of the white evangelical churches are, they do not answer to a titular head. There's no pope. There's no, it's not like a centralized authority. And there's good and there's advantage and disadvantage to that. But despite that, they have been able to mobilize and organize and, collect themselves. And their interpretation of Christianity can be seen as one aspect of that. But the aspect that I think is also always present, and really even some cases more powerful, is race. And that is what we see in these expressions around white Christian nationalism, amplified and made worse in the post-Obama era.
So when we look at government surveillance, as well as harassment, intimidation, and state authorized violence against religious communities in terms of their practices, in addition to the Nation of Islam, we also have a group like MOVE, the Christian Movement for Life, led by John Africa, founded in 1972 in Philadelphia. This is a group largely African American, but not exclusively African American, whose beliefs were, if you will, they, in terms of their religious philosophies, believed in environmentalism and protecting nature and protecting animals. They were very keen on doing that. They were very sort of keen in living in harmony with nature, but also they rejected the type of liberal progressive sort of notions that were associated with Center City, Philadelphia.
One of the things that I always find so interesting about MOVE is that it was a rejection not only of a particular kind of religious manifestation, but it really was a cultural expression tied to Africa, and a rejection of notions of modernity as well. And all of that brought them, like a perfect storm, brought them into conflict with with local and state authorities. So if we think about the Nation of Islam example that we began with, or when we began the conversation, it's an interesting moment that here we have these city folk who are wrestling with some of those issues of self-determination and how they want to live, how they want to raise their children, how they want to support themselves, and what they want no part of, but it's just seen as a particular threat in some ways, I think amplified because they are literally sitting in West Philadelphia rather than in the rural area.
Their experience, in a lot of ways, in some ways, it's very similar to that of the Nation of Islam. They're sort of politicized in a way that sort of dismisses or disregards the very fundamental sort of religious philosophies that are at the heart of sort of their experience and their practices, and they're viewed as a terroristic threat. Ultimately, what happens with MOVE is that the local authorities they move against this religious community. We see in '78 there's a shootout at MOVE headquarters. Following that shootout, several members of the community, are arrested. But there's still this notion that they are a political movement. They move several blocks away, but there's still conflict between MOVE and the state or local authorities. 1985, it comes to a head, and the city government under Mayor Wilson Goode bombs the MOVE building, and several individuals, 11 individuals are murdered, die as a result of this tragic action taken by the authorities.
Is certainly one of the most tragic of examples of a threat from a group of people whose life and approach to living and to believing really embodied many of the ideas that you lined out with the Nation of Islam, certainly a relationship to Africa, both real and imagined, and basically because MOVE was outside of any kind of traditional religious or certainly Christian framework, made them especially vulnerable to hate and hostility and resentment and fear, and the bombing and the burning and the overreaction and the tragic loss of life is what we have, in the modern age, to represent that, which is sadly a really important reminder to us of how volatile that kind of perfect storm can still be. And we've seen it in bits and dribs and drabs and in other really dramatic, examples as well. And so I think the conflict between state and religion, we still have to remember that the state represents someone's interest. And they may be political, they may be financial, but the state is not just, the guys who got elected or the police. It's like they represent in their minds some perceived community, and they're enabled and emboldened by that community. So I think one of the things that we have been asked to think about together as part of this conversation is to talk some or to think about the hope for the future of religious liberty in this country, and in the context that we've been talking about, and what our individual and personal hopes might be. And because I'm still thinking about the question, and because I raised it, I'm going to ask you to answer it first. And then by the time you're done, I'll pick up and I hope I'll have something, important to add to that.
My hope is that Black faith communities, in addition to sort of prioritizing Black economic, concerns, will also sort of revise this very activist traditions with respect to defining for themselves what it means to be, if you're a Christian, what it means to be a Christian with respect to issues of social justice.
My hope for the future of religious liberty is that, it's a double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword, and you want certainly folks to have the freedom of religion, the thing that we all need to hold in check and to try to exert influence on and are responsible to do is to think about the state and our relationship to the state and the apparatus of state power, including its use of violence and other kinds of mechanisms, and how our own relationship to the state continues to shift and evolve as well in the 21st century. So that's, and I don't know whether that's optimistic or pessimistic, but I do think that it would have been difficult in the middle of the 20th century to imagine the power of religion in politics from any group in this late, in the first quarter of the 21st century, when the narrative was all about declension and decline and decline and decline. And here we are, in this moment. And that's the mystery and power of religion, for better or for worse.